The Maid Toddler gave a dying Korean Mafia boss his last inhaler and did the unthinkable. Her name was Nari. She was 3 years old. Small hands, soft black hair pulled into 2 uneven pigtails her mother tied every morning while running late, dark eyes that noticed everything. The way steam curled off a cup of tea. The way the elevator numbers glowed orange one at a time. The way grown-ups changed their faces the second they stepped through certain doors, like they were putting on a coat they didn't want to wear. Nari's mother, Soo-jin, worked as a cleaner in the tallest, most feared building in the district. It wasn't feared because it was tall. Plenty of buildings in Seoul were taller. It was feared because of who lived in the penthouse, and because of the men in dark suits who stood by the elevators and never smiled and never explained themselves. The building was called the Biko Tower, though most people in the neighborhood didn't call it anything at all. They just lowered their voices when they walked past it. Soo-jin had worked there for a year and a half. She cleaned the top floor twice a week, always in the mornings, always with 2 men watching her from the hallway without seeming to watch her. She mopped the marble on her knees. She dusted shelves lined with things she didn't ask about. She kept her eyes down and her hands busy, because in that building, being invisible wasn't just good manners. It was survival. Nari wasn't supposed to be there that day. Soo-jin's mother, who usually watched Nari, had gone into the hospital 2 days earlier with chest pains, and there was no one else. No husband. No sister in the city. No neighbor free on a Tuesday morning. Soo-jin had already missed 1 shift that month when Nari had a fever, and her supervisor, a thin, nervous man named Mr. Beck, had told her very plainly that the people upstairs did not tolerate unreliability. He hadn't needed to say what happened to people who became unreliable in that building. Everyone already knew, in the vague, frightened way people know things they've never seen but have always heard about. So Soo-jin did the only thing she could do. She packed Nari's small backpack with a juice box, rice crackers, and a stuffed rabbit with 1 ear that had gone soft and gray from years of hugging, and she knelt down in the stairwell before they went in. "You have to be a little mouse today," she whispered. "No sound. No moving around. Can you do that for Amma?" Nari pressed her tiny finger to her lips. "Shoo," she whispered back, so seriously that Soo-jin almost laughed and almost cried at the same time. They took the service elevator to the top floor. The doors opened onto a hallway so quiet it didn't feel like part of the same city outside. Soo-jin used her key card. The door swung open onto a penthouse that looked less like a home and more like a fortress dressed up as one. Black stone floors. Low lighting. A wall of windows looking out over a city that seemed impossibly far below, like a map instead of a place. This was where Kang Joon-ho lived. He was 39 years old, and in certain rooms across 3 countries, people said his name the way they said the names of storms. Not loudly. Carefully. He had built, or taken, or inherited, no one was entirely sure which, and no one asked, control over a network that moved through the city like something underground and unseen, surfacing only when it needed to. He wore expensive suits the way other men wore armor. He had not raised his voice in a business meeting in 11 years, because he had learned early that the quietest man in the room was always the most dangerous one. He was almost never home during the day. Meetings that weren't written down anywhere. Men who came and went through the service elevator, the same one Soo-jin used. Calls that lasted 4 minutes and ended entire arrangements. His apartment, despite all its beauty, had the stillness of a place no one actually lived in. A monument to a man, not a home for one. Soo-jin set Nari down in the corner of the living room with her crackers and her rabbit, started the vacuum, and got to work the way she always did, fast, quiet, careful not to touch anything she didn't need to touch. Nari sat still for a while. She ate her crackers. She hugged the rabbit. She watched the tiny cars crawling far below like ants on a gray ribbon. Then she saw the hallway. It was long and dim, lined with closed doors, and it looked, to a 3-year-old, like the beginning of an adventure. She picked up her rabbit and walked toward it on small, silent feet, her Velcro sneakers barely making a sound on the stone. She peeked through the first door. A bedroom, dark and enormous, the bed made so perfectly it looked untouched. Boring. She peeked through the second. A room full of screens, all dark, humming faintly. Also boring. She peeked through the third door, and that's when she saw him. A man on the floor, back against the side of a heavy desk, one hand pressed to his chest, the other stretched upward toward the desk surface, fingers trembling, not quite reaching. His face had gone the color of old paper. His lips had a faint blue tint at the edges. His breathing came in short, terrible pulls, like someone trying to drink air through a straw that had been pinched almost shut. On the desk, at the very edge, just past his reaching fingers, sat a small inhaler. Nari didn't know what a mafia boss was. She didn't know what an asthma attack was, or why grown men in dark suits stood so carefully outside this apartment's door. She didn't know that everyone downstairs, everyone in the building, everyone in 3 neighborhoods, was afraid of this man. She only knew one thing, the way small children always know things before they have words for them. This man needed help. She looked at him. She looked at the small object on the desk. And she walked into the room. Nari had short legs, but she moved fast when it mattered. She crossed the room in her small pink sneakers, walking right past the man on the floor because the object on the desk was what mattered first. She had seen him reaching for it. She understood, without understanding how she understood it, that this was what he needed. The desk was tall. She was not. She stood on her toes and stretched her arm as high as it would go, and her fingers found nothing but air. She tried again, straining, making a small huffing sound like a kitten trying to climb something too steep for it. She looked around. Near the bookshelf sat a low wooden step stool, the kind used to reach the top shelf. She walked to it, gripped it with both hands, and dragged it across the floor, the scrape of it swallowed by the thick carpet. She climbed up. Now she could reach. Her small fingers closed around the cool plastic of the inhaler. She picked it up the way her mother had once shown her to pick up eggs at the market, slow, careful, both hands. She climbed back down, walked straight to the man on the floor, and crouched in front of him on her little knees, holding the inhaler out with both hands like something precious she'd been asked to guard. Kang Joon-ho's eyes, dark, unfocused, and for the first time in a very long time, afraid. Found the small face in front of him. For a moment he thought his mind was already leaving him, conjuring something impossible. A tiny girl. Uneven pigtails. A one-eared rabbit tucked under one arm. Holding out his inhaler the way a child holds out a flower they picked for no reason except that they wanted to give it to you. His chest was closing like a fist. He had seconds, maybe less. He took the inhaler. His hand shook so badly he nearly dropped it. Nari didn't move. She didn't run. She wasn't afraid of him, not because she was brave in the way adults understand bravery, but because she had never learned, not yet, that she was supposed to be. He pressed the inhaler to his mouth. Breathed in. Held it. Waited. Slowly, the terrible tightness in his chest began to loosen, not all at once, but link by link, like a chain unspooling. His next breath came easier. The one after that, easier still. The blue faded from his lips. Color crept back into his face, first at the edges, then all at once. He pressed the inhaler a second time. Breathed again. Sat there against the desk, simply breathing, which in that moment felt like the single greatest thing he had ever been given. Nari watched him the whole time. When his breathing steadied and his face looked less frightening, she sat down cross-legged on the floor in front of him, rabbit in her lap, and studied him with the serious attention only a toddler can give. "You okay?" she asked. Her voice was small and clear, like a bell heard from another room. Joon-ho opened his eyes fully and looked at her, this tiny person who had just, without hesitation or fear, walked into the most private room of a life built entirely on being unreachable, and had reached him anyway. He couldn't speak yet. His throat was raw. But his eyes. The same eyes that had stared down men twice his size without blinking, the same eyes that had never once, in front of anyone, shown a crack, filled with tears. Nari noticed. She reached out one small hand and patted his knee, 3 times, gently. "It's okay," she said. "Crying is okay. Amma says." And something broke open in Kang Joon-ho's chest that had nothing to do with his lungs. He had not cried in 19 years. Not since he was 20 years old, standing in the rain at his mother's grave, having just buried the only person who had ever asked him how his day was without wanting something from him after. He had made a promise to her that day, the kind of promise made by boys who don't yet understand what it will cost them. "I'll make sure no one can ever hurt us again." He had kept that promise the only way the world had shown him how, by becoming someone no one dared hurt. He had built walls of fear instead of stone, and they had worked exactly as well as walls always do. They kept the danger out. They also kept everyone out. He had 100 men who would die for him and not one who would sit on the floor beside him. He had drivers, guards, doctors on retainer, tailors who came to him instead of the other way around. He did not have a single person in his life who had ever told him, simply, gently, that it was allowed to fall apart sometimes. He pressed the back of his hand to his mouth. His shoulders shook. Nari waited, patient, the way children wait, and then held out her rabbit to him. He took it. He held a soft, gray, one-eared stuffed animal in hands that had, on more than one occasion, held far more dangerous things, and he wept. Soo-jin heard nothing for a long time, which was normal. Nari had promised to be a mouse, and she was a good girl who kept her promises. But then the silence changed shape. It stopped sounding like a child quietly playing and started sounding like a room with no one in it. She set down her cloth. "Nari," she called softly. No answer. Her heart knocked once, hard, against her ribs, and in that building, in that apartment, a mother's fear was not the ordinary fear of a lost child. It was something colder. "Nari, baby, where are you?" She moved down the hallway fast, checking doors. First room, empty. Second, empty. The third door stood open, and she pushed through it already rehearsing apologies, already bracing for whatever came next. She stopped dead. Her daughter was sitting on the floor of Kang Joon-ho's private office, patting the arm of the most feared man in the district, whose face was wet with tears and whose hands were wrapped around a small gray rabbit. The floor seemed to tilt under Soo-jin's feet. Oh my God. She crossed the room in 3 steps and swept Nari up into her arms so fast the little girl squeaked. "I am so sorry, sir. I don't know how she was supposed to stay. I'm so sorry, please." Her voice shook. Her whole body shook. She knew, with total certainty, what this could mean. You did not let your child wander into this man's private office. You did not let his guard see you fail at the one thing you were paid to do quietly. There would be no explaining this away. There might not even be a warning. She held Nari against her chest, braced, and waited for whatever was coming. Joon-ho looked up at her. He took a slow breath, an easy one, a whole one, and for the first time in longer than he could remember, his face held nothing guarded at all. "Please," he said, his voice still rough. "She saved my life." Soo-jin blinked. What? "I had an attack." He lifted the inhaler slightly. "I fell. I couldn't reach it." He looked at Nari, who was peering over her mother's shoulder at him with open curiosity. "She got it. She climbed up and got it for me. She stayed with me." Soo-jin looked down at her daughter. Nari looked back up at her. He was sad, Nari explained simply. "And sick." Soo-jin's knees gave slightly. She lowered herself onto the edge of a chair, still holding Nari, tears spilling without warning. She pressed her lips to the top of her daughter's head and just held her there, shaking, overwhelmed by something too large for words. Joon-ho watched them, a mother and her child, the fiercest, gentlest thing he had seen in years, and thought of his own mother. Small, tired, endlessly showing up anyway. He thought about how long it had been since anyone had come for him instead of because of him. "Your name," he said quietly. "Soo-jin," she whispered. Kim Soo-jin. He leaned forward, forearms on his knees. Mrs. Kim. Your daughter is the bravest person who has ever set foot in this building. And I include myself, and every man who works for me, in that. Jun-ho cancelled everything for the rest of the day, the first time in years he had cancelled anything for any reason. He sat on the floor of his own penthouse, the black stone, glass-walled fortress that had never once felt like a home, and let a 3-year-old lead him through an entire imaginary world built around a one-eared rabbit. She explained, very seriously, that the rabbit's name was Toki, and that Toki could fix anything that was broken. She demonstrated by pressing Toki against a faint bruise on Jun-ho's forearm, a mark from where he'd fallen earlier. Better? She asked. Much better, he said, and found, strangely, that he meant it. Soo-jin sat on the edge of the black leather sofa with a cup of tea Jun-ho had insisted on making himself, badly, because he had genuinely never learned how. She watched her daughter walk this enormous, dangerous, quietly terrifying man through a world where stuffed rabbits healed wounds and the only thing that mattered in any room was whether everyone in it felt okay. He learned that Nari's favorite color was yellow. That she was afraid of loud trucks but not of thunder. That she knew every word to a song about a fox from a cartoon Soo-jin had to hum 3 notes of before Nari picked it up, singing without a trace of self-consciousness in the middle of the most guarded apartment in the city. He learned that Soo-jin had come from a small town outside Daegu 11 years earlier, that she had once wanted to study nursing but the money had never been there, that Nari's father had left before Nari turned 1, and that Soo-jin had not looked back since, because looking back cost time she didn't have. He learned that Nari called her mother Umabile. Mama Star. Because once, when Nari was very small and scared of the dark, Soo-jin had told her that even in the blackest sky there was always one star that never went out, and that she would always be that star for Nari. Nari had decided, in the practical logic of small children, that this meant her mother's actual name was Star, and it had stuck ever since. At one point, one of his men, a broad-shouldered man named Taeyong, who had worked security on that floor for 6 years and had never once seen the inside of Jun-ho's private office, let alone seen him sitting on the floor of it, knocked and let himself in, alarmed by the cancelled meetings and the silence. He stopped in the doorway, and for a long moment he simply stood there, unable to process what he was looking at. His boss. Cross-legged. On the carpet. Holding a small stuffed rabbit up to his ear like it had whispered him a secret, while a toddler in pink sneakers narrated, with total seriousness, what the rabbit had said. Sir, Taeyong managed. Is everything? Everything is fine, Jun-ho said, without looking up. Cancel the rest of today. All of it. Taeyong hesitated. In 6 years, he had learned to read every version of his boss's silence. The silence before a decision, the silence before a punishment, the silence that meant do not ask. This was a silence he had never heard before. Not cold. Not calculating. Just still, the way a room goes still after a storm has finally passed through it. Understood, Taeyong said, and left, and told no one what he'd seen, because some things a man simply doesn't have the words for yet. Jun-ho learned, over the course of that afternoon, that Nari refused to eat the crusts of anything, that she believed the moon followed their car on purpose because it liked them best, and that she had strong, unshakable opinions about which of her 3 mismatched socks were the good ones, despite none of the pairs matching in the first place. He learned these things the way you learn a language you didn't know you were missing. Slowly, and then all at once, with the strange, disorienting sense of having been fluent in something else your whole life without realizing how much of it was static. Soo-jin watched him with her daughter and thought, not for the first time that day, how strange it was that the most frightening name in the district was currently sitting on the floor negotiating, with total sincerity, for a turn holding the rabbit. Jun-ho didn't say anything for a long moment after that. Then, quietly. I want to tell you something, Mrs. Kim, and I need you to understand it is not charity. I owe your daughter my life. Soo-jin started to protest. He raised a hand, gently, the same hand that had once, in another life, silenced rooms full of dangerous men, but this time the gesture asked, rather than commanded. I have people who owe me favors across half this city, he said. I want to use one of them properly, for the first time. There's a nursing program at Yonsei. Part-time, flexible hours, so you can still be with her. I'll cover the tuition and a living allowance, so you don't have to work 2 jobs to survive while you study. Sujin stared at him. And I want to set aside a fund for Nari. School, university, whatever she wants, whenever she wants it. It will be there. The apartment was so quiet. Somewhere below them, the city carried on, entirely unaware. Why? Sujin whispered. Junho looked at Nari, who was now walking Toki carefully along the edge of the coffee table, making small rabbit noises under her breath. Because I was dying on my own floor, he said, in an apartment full of expensive things and not one single person who would have known if I hadn't come out of that room by evening. And the only one who came for me was 3 years old, with a stuffed rabbit and a band-aid mentality about the whole world. He paused. I've spent 19 years making sure no one could hurt me again. I never once stopped to ask whether I'd built a life, or just a very well-guarded cage. He looked back at her, his eyes clear and unguarded in a way Sujin suspected almost no one had ever seen. She reminded me what it feels like when someone shows up for no reason except that you need them. 3 months later, Sujin sat in a lecture hall at Yonsei with a notebook open in front of her, surrounded by classmates half her age, writing down every word the professor said. Her hand shook slightly on the first day, not from fear, but from the strange sensation of a door long since sealed shut quietly swinging open again. She was 30 years old. She had Nari. She had, for the first time in a long time, room to breathe. Nari started at a small preschool 4 blocks from their new, slightly larger apartment, one Junho had, without being asked, made sure came with better locks and a doorman who actually paid attention. On her first day, she walked in holding Sujin's hand, spotted a boy sitting alone by the window, and walked straight over to offer him Toki without a word of introduction needed. Her teacher mentioned it at pickup, eyes a little wet. She's remarkable. I know, Sujin said. Kang Junho, for his part, did something he had avoided for 2 years. He finally let his personal doctor put him on a proper asthma management plan instead of ignoring it between crises. He gave one new standing instruction to every property, every vehicle, every office he controlled, an inhaler, always accessible, no exceptions, no matter who was in the room. He also did something else. He called his younger sister for the first time in 6 years. The sister he had quietly cut off after their mother's death, when the life he'd chosen made it too dangerous, he'd told himself, to keep anyone close. He didn't explain why he was calling. He simply said, I'd like to see you. If that's still something you want. There was a long pause on the line. I'll make tea, she said. His organization did not fall apart. The city did not suddenly become safe overnight, and Junho did not transform, in a single afternoon, into a different kind of man entirely. That isn't how any of it works, and no one who knew him expected it to. But something in how he moved through his own world shifted, quietly, at the edges, fewer things decided out of fear, a little more decided out of something closer to care. Men who worked for him noticed it without being able to name it. It was the difference between a man defending a wall and a man, for the first time, wondering what he was defending it for. On a Thursday afternoon, weeks later, he drove across the city himself, no driver, no escort, which had not happened in longer than he could recall, and parked outside a small apartment building. He knocked on the door of Unit 6B. Nari opened it. She was wearing a yellow dress, her favorite color, a crayon still in one hand. She looked up at him and broke instantly into a smile, like she had simply been expecting this all along, the way small children expect the sun to come up. You came, she announced, matter of fact, as though of course he had, as though people simply showed up for each other, always, everywhere. Sujin appeared behind her, drying her hands on a dish towel, surprised for half a second before her face softened into something warmer. I brought groceries, Junho said, a little awkwardly, holding up 2 bags. I wasn't sure what you liked. I guessed. Come in, Sujin said. He came in. It was a small apartment, colorful drawings taped to the fridge, a candle that smelled faintly of citrus, a kitchen table with 3 mismatched chairs, a home built out of very little space and a great deal of love. He sat at that table while Sujin made coffee, and Nari showed him her latest drawing. 3 figures. A tall man in a dark suit. A woman with her hair tied back. A small girl with uneven pigtails and a one-eared rabbit tucked under her arm. Above them, in careful, wobbly 3-year-old letters, "My friends." He looked at that drawing for a long time. He thought about the day he had been on his own floor, his chest closing, his hand reaching for something just out of reach, the entire world narrowing down to one single moment of total helplessness. He had built an empire out of fear because fear had felt, for 19 years, like the only wall strong enough to keep him standing. And in the end, the only thing that had actually kept him alive that day was a child with a broken-eared rabbit and a heart that hadn't yet learned to be careful with itself. He had spent his whole adult life building walls. She had walked straight through his without even noticing they were supposed to be there. He thought of his mother, and something she used to say to him, back before all of this, back when he was small enough to still believe it without proof: the biggest hearts always come in the smallest packages. He hadn't understood it then. He had thought bigness meant power, buildings, the number of people who feared your name. He understood it now. Bigness was Nari, 3 years old, dragging a stool across the floor to save a stranger she had never met. Bigness was Sujin, working 2 jobs in silence, sending nothing back but showing up every single day anyway, carrying a dream she had folded up and put away for years without ever quite letting herself throw it out. Bigness was showing up on someone's floor when they had nothing left to reach with. Bigness was calling a sister you hadn't spoken to in 6 years and simply saying, "I'd like to see you." Bigness was the smallest things, done without asking anything back. Nari handed him a yellow crayon and instructed him, very seriously, to draw himself into the picture. He was not a good artist. His version of himself looked like a block of tofu wearing a tie. Nari laughed so hard she nearly fell off her chair. Kang Junho, a man whose name, in certain rooms, still made people lower their voices, sat in a small, warm kitchen on the 6th floor of an unremarkable building, and laughed too. The kind of laugh that comes from somewhere old and buried and finally allowed back up into the light. Outside, the city turned gold in the late afternoon the way it always did, indifferent to any of it. Inside, a little girl slipped her small hand into his, and for the first time in 19 years, that, more than anything he had ever built, ever taken, ever guarded, felt like enough.